Forget the door that definitely had room for Jack. Forget the violinist who never stopped playing. We've spent a century obsessing over the tragedy of the unsinkable ship, but we rarely talk about the vessel that actually answered that SOS call when no one else would. While the Titanic was slipping beneath the Atlantic, a small, unassuming Cunard liner called the RMS Carpathia was about to become the only lifeline in the North Atlantic. This isn't just a story about a rescue. It's a story about a decision that changed the final death toll, because the passengers who made it into lifeboats weren't safe. The nearest ship, the SS Californian, never arrived in time. Others were too far away to matter. If the Carpathia hadn't turned around immediately, hundreds more would have frozen to death before sunrise. Picture it. April 15th, 1912. 12:11 a.m. The Carpathia is chugging along toward Fiume, Austria-Hungary. It's a slow, steady ship, the maritime equivalent of a reliable minivan. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, is fast asleep when suddenly, his wireless operator, Harold Cottam, bursts in. He has just received the Titanic's CQD, the old-school SOS. The Titanic is sinking, fast. Rostron doesn't hit snooze. He doesn't even ask for a second opinion. He turns the ship around before he's even fully dressed. But he's 58 miles away. At the Carpathia's top speed, it would take 4 hours to get there. The Titanic only has about 2. Rostron basically decided that if the ship couldn't go fast enough, he'd simply bully the engine into submission. He ordered the heat and hot water turned off in all the passenger cabins, so every single ounce of steam could be diverted to the engines. He looked at his crew and told them they were going north like hell. If you were a passenger on the Carpathia that night, you were freezing your toes off in a vibrating hull while the engines screamed below your feet, just so the ship could shave 30 minutes off its arrival time. But turning the ship around was the easy part. To actually get there, Rostron had to steer his ocean liner through a literal minefield of skyscraper-sized icebergs, at far above the speed the ship was built for. The Carpathia's rated top speed was 14 knots. That's about 16 miles per hour. It's not exactly a Ferrari, but that night, Rostron pushed it to 17.5 knots. He was driving a ship loaded with people in total darkness through the exact same ice field that had just gutted the largest moving object on Earth. And while the engines were screaming, the rest of the ship was being gutted and rebuilt into a floating field hospital. Rostron didn't just tell his engineers to hurry, he mobilized every soul on board. The rigid social barriers of 1912 evaporated as first-class passengers and stewards alike began hauling mattresses and prepping soup kettles. Nurses and service staff were transforming the ship into a floating trauma ward. They cleared the grand dining rooms, turning mahogany tables into surgical bays, not knowing what they were about to encounter. Every spare inch of floor was covered in mattresses. The galley was pushed to the limit, brewing gallons of hot soup and coffee, while the laundry crews were ripping up linens to make bandages. It didn't matter if you were a millionaire in first class or an immigrant in steerage. If you had a blanket or a spare coat, it went in a pile for the survivors. Even the curtains were torn down to prepare save-all nets and slings to haul people out of the water. They had the supplies. They had the will. Now they just had to survive the ice. Navigating an ice field at that speed in total blackness wasn't just bravery. It was calculated risk. Massive bergs loomed everywhere, jagged black ice invisible until it was almost too late. Rostron stood on the bridge, freezing spray turning to ice on his face. He didn't slow down. He posted extra lookouts, ordered full speed, and trusted the machinery. It was like running blind through a minefield, trusting that the next step wouldn't be your last. Later, when asked how he avoided every berg, Rostron didn't credit charts or luck. He simply said, "A hand other than mine was on the helm that night. Whatever you believe, faith or probability, he threaded a 13,000-ton liner through miles of ice without a single collision." And at 4 a.m., the Carpathia reached the Titanic's last known position, nearly an hour faster than expected. But the horizon was empty. Rostron fired a flare. No massive liner answered, only flat black water. Then, a flicker. A small green light blinking from the waves. The first lifeboat was found and the rescue of 712 survivors had begun. At sunrise, the survivors finally saw what Rostron had sailed through. Dozens of towering icebergs, some over 100 feet tall. He had pushed through that in total darkness at full speed. As the immediate danger of the ice faded, Rostron's focus shifted to the fragile state of the people now crowding his cabins. And his care didn't end when they were pulled from the lifeboats. When the Olympic, the Titanic's nearly identical sister ship, offered assistance, Rostron declined. He understood what his passengers had just escaped. For someone who had watched the Titanic disappear into the dark, seeing her twin emerge from the mist would not feel like rescue. It would feel like the nightmare returning. So he told the Olympic to keep her distance. Protection in this case meant more than speed. It meant judgment. Arthur Rostron would go on to command larger ships and retire as a knighted hero. But the Carpathia wasn't finished. When World War I broke out, she was stripped of her luxury fittings and painted in dazzle camouflage. Jagged patterns meant to confuse enemy torpedoes. The threat of the icebergs were replaced by U-boats. And for years, she carried soldiers of the British Royal Navy through the most dangerous waters on Earth. She became a lifeline of the Allied effort. Then, in July 1918, her luck ran out. While traveling in a convoy, she was spotted by the German submarine U-55. The U-boat fired 2 torpedoes. The first hit the port side, right near the engine room. The same engine room that had once gone north like hell. She was mortally wounded, but she wasn't going down without one last act of defiance. Even as the water climbed through her decks, the crew stayed at their posts long enough to send the final distress call and get 215 of the 223 people on board into lifeboats. Some say ships have a soul, that over time they begin to reflect the people who sailed them and the lives they changed. If that's true, then even in her final hours, the Carpathia remained exactly what she had always been. When the torpedoes continued to strike and the sea began to take her, she stayed afloat long enough for her crew to escape. She slipped beneath the Atlantic, still upright, nearly 500 feet down off the coast of Ireland. Steady, to the very end. The Titanic became legend, immortalized in books and films, remembered for its scale and its tragedy. But the Carpathia earned something different. She wasn't grand, she wasn't unsinkable, and she was never meant to be the hero of the story. She was just there when it mattered. And when 712 people needed someone to answer the call in the freezing dark, she did.